Welcome to Terror in Tandem, a podcast about finding entertainment in the macabre. Hosted by the knowledgeable and lovable Laura and Richard Mathiasen. Each episode, we discuss the horror genre, from books to film to TV and beyond. Sometimes even from the beyond. You can find us on YouTube at Terror in Tandem, on Instagram at Terror in Tandem, and you'll always find our latest episode on our website, terrorintandem.com.
Wow. That was the same level of authenticity as, say, a State of the Union response speech.
That was my Oscar speech.
Nice, nice. I'd like to thank the big man downstairs.
Yeah.
Wow.
His name's Walter.
His name is Walter, and he lives downstairs from us. So, what...
My name is Luca.
What are we up to today, co-host? How are you feeling? How you doing? We skipped last week.
Or did we? It's all in your imagination.
Yes.
We allowed our favorite listeners to catch up on
to
some
digest
older episodes that they
These
haven't been
are
able to catch up to.
Episodes that are just chock full of gold.
You're
And
welcome for the week off last week,
Yeah.
so you could catch up.
you
so that
need
you're
some
current.
time. There's a
Yeah,
lot of
course.
content out there, and obviously ours is the best and should take precedence. But, we understand if you want to throw something else in there for variety.
And now that you are wide awake hours and hours before you should be because of daylight savings change.
Right?
But those of you who are listening in other countries, not the U.S., probably are like, what the hell is daylight savings?
Some country. I mean, why do we do this to ourselves?
Listen,
every
I'll
year
tell you,
it gets worse.
I'll tell our
I feel
listener
worse every year.
I'll tell our listener in Israel right now that we change our clocks back and forth twice a year for an old farmer's rule, like way back
That no one wants
hundreds
anymore.
of years ago.
Yeah.
Because when you were a farmer, you got up at sunrise or before sunrise, and because of days getting shorter and shorter, we came up with this plan to change the clocks
Wow,
back
this is
and forward.
riveting.
It's really frustrating.
Yeah. No, and also we have clocks now, so
Yeah, nobody took into account that we have.
But now it's become like, we can't change it because tradition. Like, fuck that. Oh,
Well, some places and some states and some countries, like Canada, are no longer doing it.
Yeah, because legit people die. Like, lots of people die every year as a result of it.
And there's depression that happens as a result.
I think that my depression is a direct result of daylight savings time.
Wow.
I think I've boiled it down, therapists.
Yeah, exactly.
It's DST.
So anyway, back to where
Unlike
we are
DTS,
right now.
down to sad.
Yeah. Down to spin. Spin team. We are going to talk about Edgar Allan Poe today.
Edgar Allan Poe.
Right. EAP.
EAP, as he's known to, well, if he had any friends, they would have called him that.
Yeah, he killed them all. So,
we're talking about Edgar Allan Poe. Now, in our now classic original first installment, we talked about the man himself, the man, the legend, the myth, the facts, and the unknown.
Yeah.
And this time we're getting into the work, what you've all been waiting, clamoring for, writing us tons of emails about.
We've heard the
sending your
clamorings
nudes,
and the
which
constant
is not necessary.
ticking of the clock.
Of your hideous requests. So, yeah, we're going to talk about 4 short stories by the master of the macabre, because
Horror short.
to do any more than that is just too much.
Yeah, we don't want to bore you to death.
Or
do we?
Came into this, at least I did. I came into this and I was humbled. I've read all of or most of Poe's work, but it's been a while. I've seen a lot of his adaptations, and over the years I just, kind of coasted on the fact that I had read them years ago. So I figured this would be easy, and then I went and reread them, and no, I had forgotten that I've been pumping my brain full of like mid-level science fiction and fantasy for the last 20 years. So jumping back into Poe was humbling.
Yeah, it was thick.
He fancied himself a romantic poet, so that means you're Googling like every 3 seconds some ancient Greek demigod's name that no one knows.
Well, what I find, I have a book, The Collected Works of Edgar Allan Poe, and it was published in 1936, and it's a very beautiful, leather-bound, classic, gold-edged collection of all of his works.
We at Terra in Tandem have many leather-bound books amongst rich woods and expensive wines.
Right, and this is a port perfect
Nice
edition. So I reread these stories. One of them I never read before.
Which one?
Berenice.
Oh,
which we're going to talk about
personal
first.
Favorites.
But I reread all of them in this wonderful collection that I have, and I'm very happy to have it. It's got those like ragged edged pages.
Yeah.
So it feels really like I'm going back in history.
Well, I've got a first generation Kindle, which is, I guess, retro. It's slow and it's like freezes a lot.
But I wanted to pay my own secret homage to the master Poe by reading it in, these thick,
of course,
pages made of sheepskin,
inked in blood. So talking about the medium in which we consumed this macabre joy, I want to give a shout out to special friend of the pod, Rachel, for pointing me towards a lovely find. You can get this on Spotify. It's an album of Vincent Price and Basil Rathbone read Edgar Allan Poe. Now, you probably know who Vincent Price is. If you don't know Basil Rathbone, he was a classic actor from back in the day. Did a lot of Sherlock Holmes movies, but also he was, if you've ever seen the classic Robin Hood with Errol Flynn, he was Prince John. So he was the one at the other end of that legendary sword fight. And it's wonderful. There's also, if you look on YouTube, you can find a collection of Christopher Lee reading Edgar Allan Poe, and talk about voices designed perfectly for the work. Hearing Vincent Price with his, he always sounds like he's smiling inside and just having the time of his life reading these spooky stories. And then Christopher Lee gives it like the gravitas of, Christopher Lee. So it's magnificent. If you don't want to read it, I do recommend reading the words and then listening to these deep, sonorous British voices. And Vincent Price, talking about reading the stories. It's lovely. I guess I have a thing for old men reading me scary stories.
Yeah. It's great. And when we get to talk
about... We had a breakthrough here today.
When we get to talk about the adaptations episode, I'm sure we're going to dive into some of the...
100%.
Vincent Price of it all.
Oh, that's...
Because he's been in many
and that was, for your old beloved co-host, me, formative time in my life when I watched those movies, and it changed me forever. The Roger Corman, Vincent Price adaptations. But thanks, Rachel, for pointing me towards a real fucking treasure. And it's on Spotify. It's awesome.
Awesome. Well, we're going to
start... You can hear Vincent Price reading Berenice.
Nice.
Yeah.
We're going to start with Berenice.
Ooh.
The publication date is a little, like creation date, publication date's a little gray.
Well, there's a quite a reason for that, actually. Yeah.
Because there's no clear understanding when this was written, although in a letter written in April 1835 to T.W. White with the manuscript attached, he provided Berenice. And through some of the publishings, it seems like the original manuscript was destroyed as it went through into the printing
Yikes.
press.
Well, I have it that the original publication was in Southern Literary Messenger in 1835, but an edited version was published subsequently in 1840 because the public outcry over the shocking violence of the tale led to him being like, fine, stop bothering me. I'll fucking write a PG version of it. So yeah, it's been, the whole concept of fans demanding that creators bend to their will is not a new thing.
Yeah,
it's just
exactly.
a louder thing, I guess.
Well, should I give, just sort of walk through the synopsis of the story?
Before you do, can I just read the opening line, which is maybe the greatest tone setter of all time?
Yes.
Like many Poe stories, it is narrated by a first-person narrated. Unlike many Poe stories, this narrator is named. His name is Aegeus.
Aegeus. Mm-hmm.
Dope name. And like many Poe narrators, he's unreliable and crazy. But I just want to read the opening line. Misery is manifold. The wretchedness of earth is multiform. So what kind of story do you think it's going to be?
Well, you did say he is an unreliable narrator.
Sure is.
He develops mania,
Yeah.
which is a mental illness that causes him to obsess over mundane objects.
But like a singular thing.
Yes.
And he talks about these extended fugue states that he enters that he tells that are not pleasant.
Berenice, who's Aegeus's cousin.
Oh, yeah. Another husband situation.
And fiance.
Yep.
She develops epilepsy.
Hey, they say right what you know.
Yeah. She develops epilepsy, which causes her to fall into deep catatonic episodes that seem like death. And
we're going to see that theme pop up again.
Yeah. His narration and his monomania leads to an obsession with her teeth.
Yes.
Of which he commits an horrifying crime, exhuming her body.
Let's just say straight off, these are stories from 100 years ago, 200 years ago, so we can spoil them.
Yeah,
okay.
I will.
Yeah.
We'll get into the details of it. I was just giving a summary.
For sure.
So only to exhumes her body, only to later discover she wasn't really dead, y'all. It was an epileptic coma. So
oops.
It's great, So we happen upon Aegeus as a young man, and he begins displaying symptoms of a serious mental illness. I mean, I would say it's sort of OCD.
Yes.
Hyperfixation.
But to the degree that it's like he's trapped.
Yes. And he starts to process. He was born in his family's library, and he believes that this is why he's always been such an introspective, studied, introverted child.
Oh, that's why my mother dashed into the living room when she was in labor with me, because being born in a library is essentially a death sentence.
He describes himself being addicted, body and soul, to the most intense and painful meditation.
Yeah, which is how I feel when I try to meditate.
And he suggests that he is already showing signs of developing a mood disorder, even as a child, and says his disease ultimately developed into the monomaniac character.
I will give this to Poe's insane, often homicidal narrators. They are usually pretty self-aware that they're crazy. Or in the case of the Telltale Heart,
we are as the reader.
They are vehemently denying that they're crazy to the point that you're like, oh, dude, you are fucking crazy.
So when Berenice falls victim to epilepsy, it's described as a species of epilepsy. I mean, just in the way that he talks about disease.
There should be an entire disease named after Poe that is just sort of a nebulous wasting away of beautiful newlywed women that they just get fall into catatonic states and then they semi-die only to come
sometimes
back. Yeah.
Semi-die. But according to Aegeus, her disease reduces her from a human being to an object. He starts to refer to her as it.
Yeah, he is unkind.
He describes her before the illness as agile, graceful, and flowing with energy. And her disease, he calls the destroyer, strips her of all these qualities. And aside from the physical changes, he said her mind, her habit, and her character knew her no longer as Berenice.
Now, on the one hand, I want to be kind here, because I think a lot of us have watched a loved one suffer and waste away.
Yes.
I have, and it's horrible. And there are physical and psychological and emotional changes, and he's describing that pretty accurately. But Poe's narrators often have this duality to them, where the way they talk about women is like they're untouchable goddesses on a pedestal that can never be approached, but also I hate them and I'm repulsed by them, but I'm obsessed with them and I can't stop thinking about them, but they disgust me. It's weird.
Well, he also, Poe also talks about, the narrator's love of Berenice and
his cousin,
sexual attraction and sexual repression.
Got a real Rudy Giuliani over here.
She's constantly falling into catatonia.
Yeah, the perfect girlfriend.
Yeah, wife. I mean, fiance, I should say.
Yeah.
So one of the scenes shortly before falling into a catatonic state, she stands in the doorway of the library and smiles at him.
Yeah.
And shows her perfect teeth, like her beautiful teeth. And
her
then
crime is smiling at her quote unquote beloved.
That's where Aegeus starts to really obsess about the teeth. And then there's a French phrase that Poe puts in here, which I am not going to repeat because I don't speak French.
And we don't want to alienate any of our lovely French potential listeners.
But the English translation is, all her teeth were ideas. So this continues to run through her mind.
No, Aegeus, they're teeth.
His mind, sorry. It runs through his mind. She goes into this catatonic state and it triggers a burial. Everybody's like, she's dead,
Yeah, and this is where I have some questions, because Aegeus at this point is locked into one of his monomaniacal catatonias.
Well, he starts to disassociate.
Yeah. And
as
so
we do
his
with
servants,
him, because we quite don't know what is happening, because he's telling the tale.
We are seeing and we're unraveling the goings on as he learns them, and he's learning them as he goes in and out of these fugue states. So it's like bits and bobs of information. But my question is, so he's not involved in her actual death or the burial. Who are his fucking servants, man, that bury his cousin alive? Like, they have a whole thing.
Yeah, there's a whole funeral.
You're gonna need to get some new help.
But she's, who knows? She's in a coma. People in 1843.
This is another Poeism, because in real life Poe was quite afraid of being buried alive. This is actually a common Victorian fear amongst especially the wealthy, to the point where an entire industry developed selling safeguards, including strings that would attach to a bell on the gravestone, run into the casket, and then if you woke up, you'd pull on the bell and the grave digger would know, oh, that dude's, I got to dig him up.
Well, we're going to see a lot, I feel like, in the 4 that we chose, which is just happenstance that we chose these 4.
We literally did
quite a thread of death, reincarnation, not dead, alerting dead, still alive, hauntings.
It seems that Poe's primary obsession in reading these stories was, is death a state of permanence, or is it transitory? Can it be reversed? Is there a universal law around it? Because the laws of death in his stories vary wildly. The cause of death is often, I don't know, she just kind of one day wasted away.
Yeah, so basically,
like, that's a thing that could just happen to people.
To wrap up the story, as you were saying, his servants come in and he's in his pajamas and he's covered in mud. And and he, they knock over a tin next to his bed, or the table near where he's sitting.
And what falls out?
Berenice's teeth. All 32 of them.
Every single tooth.
So what happened was, in Aegeus's monomania episode, he exhumed Berenice's still living body and ripped out every single one of her teeth, one by one, and put them in a tin and
Imagine
went back
that.
home
Yeah.
as if nothing. What are you talking about?
And he does say that right before he comes back to consciousness, he registers that a woman is screaming, which we take to be Berenice.
Yes.
So now, so much of what Poe, the horror behind Poe, and this is why I love Poe so much, it's my favorite kind of horror, is the horror of dread and of implication, of you tell me part of the story and then I put the rest of it together, and once I do that, oh God, it's much worse. So picture Berenice waking up in a coffin and freaking the fuck out. Oh my God. Can you imagine anything scarier than being buried alive? Then all of a sudden, her
beloved exhumes
rescues
her, and she's
her.
like, oh, thank goodness.
Yes, that moment of absolute exultation.
And he's in whatever state.
His
he's
eyes
in.
are glassed over. He's not answering her. What's wrong with you, honey? And he holds her down and rips out
Every
all of her
single one
fucking
of her
teeth
teeth
one by one.
And then
Collects them like a weird creep.
no one knows what happens
Yeah.
after. Does he put her
And-
back in the
Well, I think she
box
like
and
starts
bury her?
wandering around
Right.
and shit, just all bloody mouth and fucked up,
Yeah.
and covered in dirt, and the servants freak out. I mean, this story is one of my favorites because it's a short one. It gets right to the point, and it is horrific.
The line, it basically is a couple lines at the end. The
Mm-hmm.
tin falls on the floor and all of the 32 teeth.
So
white
what I
teeth
just
fly
described
out.
is not written, but that's the implication. That's what you're left with. The story ends with the gut punch of the teeth, and then you're just sitting there gasping like, whoa.
So I want to go a little deeper because there are a couple of instances of Aegeus, in his room alone, like dealing with his stuff.
Okay.
Essentially, I think that he's sexually repressed. He is not able to have sex with this ailing fiance. He becomes so obsessed with these teeth, thereby basically taking away her personhood, her individual, her humanity, and rips her teeth out. Basically takes what he wants. It's sort of like a rape almost.
Oh, it's an incredible violation.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, there is no, the idea of like, oh, I don't know what I'm doing, doctor. Like, fuck that. You did it. It's,
And his loss of humanity, we'll see this again in some themes of the other narrators that we encounter, is, he completely loses his humanity.
And Poe, you're right to mention that the sexual nature of it, because there is a distinct sexuality to Poe's stories, and it's always the sense of someone who deeply wants women,
Mm-hmm.
but is at the same time utterly terrified of them.
He's like so enamored of her and in love with her, and
But he
is now
just wants to, like-
unfianced to her.
It's kind of like
And then he finds out that she sort of despises him.
he wants.
You know what I
think
mean?
the narrators are the kinds that want to keep their women like in cryostasis and never touch them and never interact with them, but like look at them and be like, oh, her teeth, oh, her eyes, oh, her features, those features of the ancient Grecian gods. Like, but the idea of interacting with them, the narrators are always like, she repulsed me. I hated
Well, what
her.
I was saying is basically he breaks her down to an it, becomes obsessed with something that was so pure, white, beautiful. Those are her like teeth, they're part of her.
Yes.
Because she makes it pretty clear that she's not really into him. And so he takes that power back and says, well, I am going to take from you something that I now am obsessed with. If you can't love me back, then I'm going to take your teeth.
What I truly, that's an interesting read. I did not read it that way, but I can see that.
100%.
I want to say also that you and I purposefully stayed away from outside literary analysis because we really wanted to do this ourselves. We're analyzing. This is our opinion and our readings of it. So if you disagree, of course, you're free to. That's what this is.
Start your own podcast.
Yeah, start your own goddamn podcast with billions of listeners. And the one thing I really appreciate about Poe's narrators is while they one of the tropes is they do objectify women. They don't objectify them in the way you'd think. They're not objectifying them like some lascivious, sexual dude just being like, oh, look at her, blah, blah, blah. They're objectifying her like a taxidermist would. Or like...
Yeah, they're very disposable.
And it's extremely clinical and almost like they're not analyzing a living, breathing human person. They're analyzing...
But an object.
Yes, a literal object. Whereas when we think of objectifying women, it's more apt to say sexualizing women. His narrators literally are objectifying women, as in they are turning them into objects.
Yes. And
analyzing them with the cold sterility of like a psychopathic surgeon.
And doesn't leave any room for human characteristics, including flaws.
Absolutely. And the moment...
It's either heavenly, otherworldly, magical, or it's totally drained of life and all humanity.
Speaking of Berenice, where the next one we're going to switch to is really the opposite there, because while Berenice has her agency completely taken away from her, that is not the case
with our
the
next tale.
Titular queen, Ligeia.
So let's get into it.
Let's get into it.
Published in 1839, we have an unnamed narrator this time.
Yes.
Which
is much more common in Poe stories. He usually doesn't name his narrator.
He describes this woman that he is fascinated by. So white with black hair and black eyes, named Ligeia. She's so mysterious to him. He doesn't remember or can't recall when or how they met. He becomes obsessed of her beauty and character.
Yeah,
and describes her with...
That's the thing, is he doesn't remember real things like, how do I know this person who is a person? He just goes on and on and on about the shape of her eyes.
Well, he describes her for many pages, but with large white forehead webbed with blue veins, with dark eyes and a stream of raven black hair. It's like his own sea witch.
Yes.
This is like a sea witch that's come out of the magical water into his life.
I wrote in my notes, he describes her like she's a fae creature.
Yeah.
I know. And also, I think I wrote in my notes, like, this dude's never seen a woman in his life.
So this Ligeia is very strong.
He's just
very strong,
frescoes.
Opinionated. She is well read in the ways of reincarnation.
She has a lot of forbidden knowledge.
Yes. And once they marry, she teaches him dark arts.
Which, I wasn't expecting it, but it was a real joy in the first 6 months of our marriage when you introduced me to the dark arts. And thank you for that.
You're welcome.
The trust that you placed in me, and I really hope that I haven't violated. There was that one zombie outbreak, and I've apologized for that, but...
So then consumption drains the life from her, and she composes The Conqueror Worm, a poem about the cruelty of death, and recites it to her husband on her deathbed. And basically, he is now a broken man. Not too broken.
Quick aside about The Conqueror Worm. So, two things. Right in the middle of this story, which, as you stated, the first half of it is basically this guy gushing
my
about
love.
Yeah, and that's the other thing about Poe's narrators. They love to say the woman's name. Berenice, Ligeia, Annabel Lee, Lenore. So, yeah. As I do, I'm constantly running around the streets yelling, Laura! Laura!
The narrator is positioning himself to be completely transfixed and possessed by this beauty.
It's like the
woman,
way he describes,
creature.
If someone were to describe their spouse to you in this manner, you would go through this range. You'd be like, oh, that's kind of nice. Wow, that's okay. He's been talking for a... Oh, that's a little bit much. Jesus Christ, dude. Like, are you married to your mother? It's weird. And so he spends all this time, the story up until this point is essentially this creep over praising his wife, and I really mean it. Like, it's, and deliberately so, to the point where you're like, this isn't really love.
Yeah,
This is
essentially a
something
stranger.
else.
He's just enraptured by her beauty and knows that she is
so
kind of a witch.
Then there's a multi-stanza poem right in the middle.
Yeah.
And this poem was actually previously published by Poe, who began his career as a poet. And I am particularly fond of some of his poetry, but I will not say that he is a great poet. He just isn't. He's more, his ideas and his atmosphere are stronger than his actual
But smartly
grasp
here,
poetry.
Poe obviously wrote that poem, not being well known or well received for his poetry.
It did not.
Puts it on her. Like Gia's the author of this poem.
Shoves it back into the story.
Yep.
Being like, you know,
Like
nobody
Gia wrote
liked
this
this.
poem.
Nobody liked this the first time, but when you read it in the context of the story, and later on when you find out the meaning of the poem, also it's a fucking great poem. I love that poem.
The Conqueror Worm.
I love The Conqueror Worm. It's incredible.
It sounds like something from Dune.
It's about death and decay,
Yeah.
you know. But but it's staged like a sort of masquerade put on by like weird ancient gods and creatures, and all hail the Conqueror Worm, because that conquers all of us. We'll all be eaten by worms. Anyway, so he throws this in the middle, right? And then he contextualizes it at the end, giving further backstory to his own poem. I mean, it's just a brilliant move.
It's a very egotistical move.
And Poe
where
has
he's
proven,
like, I am going to force you
Poe's
all
proven
to
many, many times.
eat this poem.
And it was very well received in this incarnation.
Exactly.
Which, man...
Well, when like Gia writes it, though.
Yeah. Hats off to you, sir. That is nicely done. That's like, you know, the equivalent of meeting, someone at a Starbucks and being like, oh, how did my screenplay get there? It fell out of my bag. Well, why don't you keep it?
Why don't we take a break and then finish talking about Lygia?
Let's do it. She deserves it.
Hey, you. Dealing with that time of the month? Or are you just feeling a little moist in your nethers? If you're dealing with that smelly moss where your bathing suit covers, try Swamp Witch Feminine Care. With Swamp Witch Feminine Care, you can use our wipes, sprays, and cleansers that are all gentle enough for your privates, but strong enough for your smelliest, swampiest, and witchiest stink. You can use them anywhere and anytime. We do recommend that you use after your curses and coven works. This way, you can be fresh for rest and save the stink for your potions. Swamp Witch Feminine Care will cover that smelly nightmare so you can keep scaring all of the village children without missing a beat. Refer a fellow witch and get 10% off your next order. This is a fake ad for a fake product and a horror-themed podcast. We do not believe in smell-shaming swamp or other witches.
So do you think, he ever hit any of the ladies up with, so can I interest you in some Edgar Allan poetry? Because, I mean, honestly, a real missed opportunity.
I mean, he puts the Poe in poet.
Anyway, so getting back to Lygia.
So he's so upset that this love of his life is now dead. He marries Lady Rowena. And
yeah, he's upset for a minute.
Total opposite. Petite, blue-eyed, blonde hair.
And listen,
like simple-minded woman.
Spare a thought for Lady Rowena.
Yeah.
She seems like, honestly, from the brief amount of time she has, first off, no one deserves this.
Her title is the most impressive part. Her full-length title.
Do you remember it?
I know it's Lady Rowena of Tremaine.
Oh, Tremaine. Tremaine. Yeah. So poor Lady Rowena, she doesn't deserve any of this, and she seems like just a nice, sweet young woman who marries a real creep.
Yeah, he buys this abbey,
as you do,
and they move...
with Lygia's money.
Yep,
because he didn't have any money. She was wealthy beyond imagining, and when she died, she left him everything.
Yeah, he's so upset.
Yeah, he's got a tough life.
And so they move into this Gothic tower of the Abbey, and it's got this intense decoration, like gold tapestries with Kabbalic and occult symbols all over the place.
Amazing flex. You are an older widower married to a young ingenue, and you're like, hey, let's move into this Gothic abandoned abbey.
Tower in the middle of nowhere.
Welcome to your new life.
And the narrator now becomes addicted to opium.
Sure does. And boy, does he talk about it. Good for you, dude, because acknowledging your incredible opium use constantly is the first step.
Well, he first talks about their first couple of weeks of marriage,
which
constantly
sounds
betting her.
Terrible.
And then she falls ill.
Yeah, but he also talks about like how
suddenly
he hates
falls
her.
ill within days of moving into this place.
Yeah.
And
with
so,
another one of those
yeah,
unspecified sleepy diseases.
Right.
He's
watching over her.
This is why every time you fall asleep at night, I am just terrified.
He sits like watching over her all the time in his opium stupors.
It's like what I do.
And
when
Rowena,
you're sleeping, I smoke opium and I stare at you for hours on end like a normal loving husband does.
Rowena, bless her, she starts to get paranoid about the room they're in. She thinks something's lurking. She's hearing sounds
behind the tapestries.
As he uses more opium and she gets closer and closer to death, he basically hands her a goblet of wine, like, here,
that is my favorite. I'm so glad you mentioned that.
Here, you're dying. Drink this wine.
But he also specifies that it's wine left to her by the physicians.
Yes.
So it's prescription wine, everybody.
Yeah, prescription wine. Right.
Prescription wine. You're dying?
Here, drink your wine, honey.
A goblet.
Drink your wine. And then he sees 3 drops of blood, blood red fluid, fall into her drink.
3 ruby drops.
And then she's dead
and
in
she said
3
also
ruby days.
He says nothing.
No.
He just goes, yeah. And
drink it up.
Honestly, in his defense, he does immediately say, maybe it's the opium. Because I've been, again, as I may have mentioned once or twice, been smoking
so much opium.
Pounds of opium.
I'm smoking the most opium I've ever smoked.
Yeah. While watching my wife slowly die
and
do? Smoke opium. Also, he makes this one mention of like, I found my reprieve alone. And I was like, is that
jerking off?
Yeah. Or smoking opium or both.
Right.
But listen, your young wife that you forced to move to an abbey is dying because
a mysterious death all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Now she's dying because
so he doesn't tell her about the 3 ruby drops, which were dropped in there by a spectral figure standing behind her.
And she dies 3 days later.
Yeah.
And as he sits with her shrouded body all wrapped up.
This is fucked up.
He starts to dream and obsess about Ligeia.
Yeah, I can't stop thinking about Ligeia. With his dead new wife right in front of him.
And so the corpse moans and eventually rises and stands in the room, removes the cloth on her face.
Well, hold on. You're skipping a part. Before that happens, she goes through this cycling of almost coming back to life.
Back to life.
And then dying. But when she dies, she becomes more decrepit than the last time. And this happens all night long. No. It happens all night. He is in this like opium fever dream. The first few times he tries to help her. And then he says after that, he was just paralyzed by fear. And he watches it. As she struggles to come back to life, her cheeks redden. She starts to moan.
But then she
dies
again.
and like starts to rot. And then finally, what you said.
Yeah, the corpse rises and stands in the room, and he removes the cloth on her face and sees flowing black hair and black eyes.
The big eyes.
It is Ligeia! Exclamation point.
All
That's what
caps.
I wrote in my notes.
Yeah. And he does mention about her eyes that they were pupilless at times.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So she's obviously some sort of weird witch or creature, but man, taking over the body at the end is so great. And the fact that he is, by his own admission, and the way Poe writes this narrator, is this like weak, pathetic man. And he spends this awful night, largely watching this happen.
Well, Ligeia promises that she's going to come back.
She does.
And by marrying Rowena, that's what Ligeia does to plan her vengeance. And she wills herself back to life. And all she needs, honestly, is for him to conjure her back.
This is really, I mean, honestly,
As
I want you to know that I did this before I read this story. It's so similar to the notes that I left you in case
If you
of my
think
death.
about it like this, okay, when she's newly dead and he starts
Freshly
to think
dead.
of Ligeia, then Rowena comes back to life and dies again. His thoughts of Ligeia become stronger and stronger.
Yeah, it's like he helps her back.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
she willed herself into the body of the recently departed Rowena after poisoning her.
And the way he talks about her at the beginning of the story is he kind of freely admits that, like, I am subservient to Ligeia. I'm nothing to her. I'm nothing in front of her, you know. And then by the end, he's essentially worshiping her like a resurrected goddess.
And now this is very unreliable because we have the narrator telling us that he is consumed with grief and opium.
And jacked up on goofballs.
And so is he responsible for the reanimation? Did his relationship with Ligeia bring about this restoration?
Or
is he imagining everything?
Just a fevered
Hallucinating.
junkie sitting with a slowly decomposing dead lady Rowena.
Either way, we have this story.
I know.
That
and
lives on.
Now this is one
Just
of
like Ligeia.
this story is amazing. It's so good because of the turn it takes. It's quite a dense read because, like,
honestly,
like we
it's
mentioned,
the description of Ligeia, the first couple of pages is a lot.
but it does establish the insanity of this character.
And
of,
also
like,
the
Jesus, man. I felt the same way. I was like, dude, shut the fuck up
full
about your wife.
penetration of her presence in his life.
We don't normally show full penetration on this podcast, but we decided to do it for this episode. Now,
So those were our ladies.
Poe himself, soon after completing this story, wrote to a friend and said, I think I just wrote the best story I've ever written. This was his favorite story, and it is largely regarded as his masterpiece. None other than George Bernard Shaw himself praised it as unparalleled.
Wow.
Which,
I mean, listen, all of them are great.
yeah.
My personal favorite is not that, but
It's
very
not my
much
favorite either.
appreciated it.
No, but it is, I would say, of his story, it is the most quote unquote literary. And by that, I mean,
Well, it's very like gothic.
it's very much a product of the Victorian era.
Yes.
It is chock full of Greco-Roman references, biblical references,
Yes.
Latin, you know, stuff like that. Ooh, real quick. I'm so sorry. I forgot this. Jetting back to Berenice for 2 seconds, there is a Latin phrase in there that I wanted to mention. I'm not going to say it in Latin because I don't want to offend our many Latin speakers. Looking at you, Quintus. But the phrase translates to, this is how it ends. My companion said to me, if I would visit the grave of my friend, I might somewhat alleviate my worries. That turned out not so much to be the case for Aegeus, who, as we just mentioned, ripped out his still living wife's teeth. But I thought that was a nice knife twist at the end to include this Latin saying of, like, go visit your friend's grave. It'll make you feel better. And,
Absolutely.
you know, dig them up and rip out their teeth. So sorry about that.
So anyway, those are the two ladies, and now we're going to move on to the two men.
Yes. And these next two stories, we're going to sort of do them back to back because you're going to notice some similarities. But I say we start with the 1843 short story first appearing in the Saturday Evening Post, The Black Cat.
So, I want to just tell you a little tale before we get into this story.
Oh, please do. Tale. I get it. Cat.
In the summer of 1842,
Oh, I remember it.
near Northfield, Massachusetts, a ferry operator named George Stebbins was tearing down a stone wall in the cellar of his home when he discovered a skull, a spine, and the bones and arms of someone.
Oh.
The remains were packed in less than 3 foot of space, and the Greenfield Democrat published this news story, and it's believed to have been the inspiration for the story of the Black Cat,
Nice.
which was published about a year later.
Oh, goodness. I did not know that. Old Stebbins.
Yeah.
It's a little rare in America, but every once in a while in Europe, this just happened in Germany. There'd be like excavating a place for a new housing development or something, and they dig up like a plague grave.
So many people find things.
Yeah, it's like 1,000. And whenever you hear like mass grave discovered in Germany, it's just never great. But that is horrifying. So the black cat.
Yeah. So this narrator, again, unnamed, starts
also a real dick.
Yeah. Well, not at the start.
I'm gonna go on record and say anyone who acts this way was always a jerk.
Well, he starts out telling about his boyhood, which was very easy and enjoyable, and he had a big love of animals, had lots of pets, and when he met his wife, she very much loved having pets, so including a black cat named Pluto. So,
or as I call him, Justice Cat, and we'll explain that in a second.
Yeah, one night Pluto attacks him in self-defense.
Which, if you've ever owned, met, or seen a cat, happens. And
so then our narrator, who has now self-proclaimed taken the sauce, taken to alcoholism.
Yes.
His character has changed. He's miserable. He's violent to people. He's grumpy. So he starts to treat his animals badly, including Pluto. So when he goes to sort of kick Pluto out of the way, the cat defends himself and scratches the narrator. And the narrator is so pissed.
He does a very normal thing.
He gouges the eye of the cat out and then hangs the cat.
Well, yeah, two separate occasions. He gouges the cat's eye out and then feels bad about it for a minute, and then I guess gets mad again and hangs the cat with a noose.
Yeah.
Which, think about that for a second. He had to sit down, take a rope, tie up a noose, which takes a few minutes.
But then that night, after he hangs the cat, a fire destroys his home, leaving him and his wife impoverished and out on the streets.
Yep. And Don't
so,
hang your cat.
Yeah. He goes to the home recently destroyed and sees the only thing left is a wall with a relief in the wall similarly looking like his murdered cat.
Which, now this obviously happened 100 years before the advent of nuclear weapons, but it's kind of like what they found
in Pompeii.
No, in Hiroshima. Of after the flash, they would see just images of people on the wall because that was all that was left.
In Pompeii, though, too, with the explosion, the ash would like encapsulate.
So it's kind of like they blasted into the wall. Yeah.
So he explains it as the cat must have been thrown into the window when people saw the flames and gotten stuck into like a recently plastered wall because he's not going to tell everybody he killed him.
Yeah.
And so he starts to, drink more, feels bad. His wife is like, I don't want you around.
Yeah.
So he finds a replacement cat.
Yeah.
The thing
Solve
is,
your problems.
He takes this replacement cat that he meets at the local tavern. It's a one-eyed cat with white on its chest.
That's the one difference.
And the white on its chest actually is in the shape of.
So it's just a white puff of hair, but as he, goes crazier and gets drunker, it starts to look to him like a hangman's gallows.
Yes. So he thinks that this cat is, out to get him. Mm-hmm. He starts to want to get rid of the cat. He doesn't want the cat around. So he decides to kill this cat with an axe. He misses and kills his wife instead, according to this alcoholic narrator.
Yes.
Again, this is a accident, right? But he doesn't even flinch.
Well, there are two ways to read it. He is someone whose cat is haunting him, or he's in a police station going, I meant to swing the axe at my cat and I hit my wife.
Well, he doesn't have to go to the police station because he doesn't even take a minute to think about it. He is like, you know what? I'm just going to put her in this wall. I'm just going to put her behind this wall. It's fine.
Yeah.
And he puts her in the wall and puts the wall back together.
Again, lifted directly from my will. Put in wall. Just amazing.
And he looks to find the cat because he's like, I need to take care of this cat once and for all. Can't find the cat.
But what he can do is get a good night's sleep.
So well
sleep so well because his cat isn't there and his goddamn wife isn't nagging him.
And then the police wake him up and are like, we're here to figure out what happened to your wife.
And this is my favorite part of the story.
And he's like, yeah, come on in. Look around. Look anywhere you
crime.
want. He's like, the narrator at this point fears no remorse.
Is on top of the world.
Fear.
He has no cat, no wife.
And in an act of hubris, he says to the cops, look at the solid construction. And he taps on the stones.
Where he just covered up his dead wife's body.
And all of a sudden there's a wailing. And this wailing everyone can hear.
Yep.
And so the cops are like, what is this?
We're going to break down this wall.
They break down the wall, see the wife's body, and then they find a black cat sitting on top of her head.
Justice cat.
Now, again, this is all described to us by the narrator. He also wonders if the police can see the cat. Is it just him that can see the cat?
Oh, yeah. He's like completely lost it. It's up to interpretation, but it reads like, a frenzied alcoholic who is making up excuses for his crimes and then starts to believe it because he's losing his mind. Or you could read it like Pluto is a supernatural justice cat out for justice.
Yeah.
But
black
my favorite
cats are constantly
my favorite is him
with witchcraft. So
knocking on the wall and being like, nothing in there.
Be like, look at this solid construction.
Yeah.
As like things crumble behind it.
It's a perfect hubris,
If you get a chance, you should look up some of the illustrations.
It's been adapted. We're going to talk about
just
that.
The illustration of this actual moment.
Oh,
where
goodness.
all the cops are around and they have this like decrepit dying corpse with a cat on its head.
Yeah.
And
It's like our wedding
the narrator's
invitations.
like being held back by the police. It's quite something.
Yeah. Well, we love the black cat, and that leads us into the last story we're going to be discussing, which is thematically has a lot of similarities, but is more like
Oh, it's definitely
it's a refinement.
page turner.
Yeah.
First of all,
like the Black Cat was a rough draft for this.
Everybody knows sort of this story in passing or whether you've read it or not. And I will tell you that this is the most thrilling page turner, frenetic, obsessive short story by Poe.
It is. It really is. It moves at a brisk pace. It starts off right away with the narrator showing you exactly the kind of person they are. He's a frantic, manic narrator who is babbling and in a state of mania, whose first words are basically like, hey, so I'm not crazy. I'm totally
not crazy.
I know
You're
this might
crazy.
sound crazy, but I'm definitely not crazy. You know who's not crazy? This guy. Don't look at me if you're looking for crazy.
And so he's like, now let me tell you how not crazy I am.
So it actually starts true, nervous,
Yeah.
very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am. But why will you say that I am mad?
Yeah.
Hey, look, I know I look like I might be crazy, but why'd you say that?
He's like a twitchy madman.
Yeah, he's nuts. David Dasrellmain should play this in the movie.
But he also is sort of saying, listen, though, I'm just going to tell you about what happened. And
you make up your mind.
It's a familiar course of action for a story who knows Poe.
Did we say the story we're talking about?
The Telltale Heart?
Telltale Heart.
I think we did.
Telltale Heart, everybody.
And so it's a familiar place where Poe likes to put us, which is in between an uneasy state of where you act strong in ways that destroy others and not believing that you're superior to others, but you try to maintain as you assert, your knowing over your accusers.
Also,
here it's the police, but also himself.
Poe is able to
It's
accomplish something
self-destructive.
in his stories that is very, very difficult to do. Most audience members need someone of sympathy to hold on to. Poe very rarely writes a character that is sympathetic. At least the narrator. His victims are sympathetic, but the narrator is usually the villain. And yet, you're reading this story wondering, is he going to get caught? Is he going to be all right?
But it's his own. He undoes it. He's his own undoing.
Yeah, I mean, Poe being the Gothic romanticist he was very much into the Grecian concept of ironic justice.
Just a quick
and hubris
overview.
being its own undoing.
Exactly. Just a quick overview of the story is a nameless man, narrator, is the caretaker of an older nameless man.
I like to think that all of the nameless narrators are just Aegeus. Like from Berenice, just hopping around like a fucked up Forrest Gump. He just shows up at all the worst things.
Yeah.
He's like, yeah, so this week I was in this pit and there was this pendulum.
So the older man's eyes, you'll miss it if you blink. The reason why he ultimately kills this man.
Interesting.
The older man's eye is extremely bothering.
Yeah,
to the caretaker.
He hates his eye. He's just he's. It's not clear to me necessarily if he's like
he calls
a tenant
it a vulture eye
or a landlord or just like
caretaker.
A house. Oh, okay. Yeah, so they live in the same place. He's just
the
old
caretaker
guy,
of the old man.
And his crime seems to be he's got a janky eye.
He's got a vulture eye, and so he decides impulsively to kill the man. And
it's the only way to deal with that.
He is like, I want to hide the body where no one will find it.
No one.
So again, I said this is a page turner, but he describes how he creeps into the old man's bedroom while he slept and then stabs him and drags the corpse away, dismembers it.
The whole sequence of him
getting into the room
painstakingly,
it takes hours.
But it is so listen, for any nerds that have played like Metal Gear Solid or a stealth game, it's like that sense of tension,
creaky floorboards. Yeah. There's no white sound.
Also, the dude
makers.
Sleeps with his weird eye open.
Yes,
so that's
exactly.
creepy.
So he never knows if he can see him or he's awake.
Yeah, and it's like the way he describes it.
The door
not to
creak.
Shame anyone's appearance, but it does sound like a pretty gooey, fucked up eye.
The door creaks. The boards creak. He puts it takes him probably, I don't know, 4 hours to put his head in the door.
Yeah, it's an unbelievable, and it's a demonstration. That's the way Poe does such a good job of showing you the depths of pathology of his narrators, because who the fuck would spend that much time sneaking into a room? You have the willpower. But it's all
for naught, because when he finally does get in the room and he's not quite sure if the guy's faking sleep or not, he rushes at him.
Yeah.
And the guy wakes up in his bed and screams really loud.
Yeah, he basically just snaps.
And so then he stabs him to death and he takes him to the bathtub, chops him up.
Yeah,
and
that's
hides
the best
his body
place to do
parts.
it, honestly.
Well, he laughs about it.
You got so mad at me when I did it on the carpet.
He laughs about it, and he says basically
live,
the
laugh,
tub
chop
caught
up
all the
bodies.
blood. There wasn't a trace of blood because the bathtub caught it all.
Yeah.
So he goes through.
It was like an infomercial for bathtubs.
Yeah, he goes through some lengths to cover it up. The bathtub,
the choppings.
And then he takes up 3 floorboards. Again, 3. 3 is an important number. As we go through these deep dives, look out for the number 3.
Oh, yeah. Listen,
I know it's a big number in religion.
Yeah, and that's why it's used so often. There's never a classic biblical symbol that Poe wouldn't jump at.
So he brings up these floorboards and puts different parts of his body concealed under there.
A little over here.
And basically is yeah, that's great. I'm done. I'm going to sit down for a minute, catch my breath, and then there's a knock at the door.
Job well done.
It's the police.
Oops.
Having been called out by a neighbor who heard a scream in the night.
The scream.
So the police come in, and again, just like the narrator in The Black Cat, he's like,
Oh, yeah.
Look around, my friends.
Yeah. Let me
Look
make you
around.
some tea.
Well, that doesn't happen quite yet. But they look around. They're convinced that everything's fine. And he invites the police to sit down and relax a
that's
spell.
the best. They're going to leave. They're like, well, nothing to see here.
Yeah.
And he's like,
Why
no,
don't you sit
come on,
down?
sit. Which is the part where you're like, oh, you want to get caught. Like, that's why.
And it's sort of like, you know, they're sitting on top of the dismantled body parts of
And I think
the
that's
old
what
man.
does it for him is the perverse power play of having the investigating cops sit above the dismembered victim. And he's just serving them tea.
So I don't know if it's a moment of post dismemberment clarity or whatever, but
That's when I
his
feel at
guilt-
my clearest.
His guilt starts to penetrate so deeply
Yeah.
that he starts to hear a ticking. And he's convinced that it's getting louder. And he's convinced that the cops can see him. Or hear it, sorry. The cops can hear it.
Yep.
And
At
he
first
just
he's
basically
cool,
blurts out.
But at first he's like, oh, nothing. It's nothing.
He basically blurts out, okay, I did it. He's under the floorboards. Like there was not even any sort of suspicion.
This is a Wendy's. He's sitting there. These dopey cops are just like, boop, boop, having my tea. Nothing to see. This upstanding citizen. He's getting sweatier and sweatier, trying to smile at these cops, but all he hears is this ever-increasing sound of a heartbeat thumping beneath the floorboards to the point where it's like vibrating in his bones. And he thinks that the cops are deliberately doing this to torture him. And he stands up and shouts, "Villains! Dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here is the beating of his hideous heart." And I love the image of these two, like, in my mind, they have mustaches. 19th century cops.
Yeah, they got
with
those
like
tall
their bowler
hats.
hats on and just being like sipping their tea. What? What? And
I mean, it hasn't even been a day, so the smell is probably not even there yet.
No,
but
he's like immediately like, and by the way, I fucking killed him.
he's so close to getting away with it.
But that's the wonderful.
But he won't let himself.
That's the wonderful
Self-destructive.
justice, the karmic justice of Poe's stories, is that characters usually do not get away with what they've done, and their torture is madness.
Well, this is what happens, in my opinion. This is my reading of what happens. So the narrator inviting the officers to search well reveals the narrator's desires for the officers to find the body. He doesn't realize it yet, but the guilt is building inside of him, and his arrogance is a manifestation of this guilt.
Oh, sure.
So-
A lot of killers do that.
Yeah.
Revisiting the scene of the
Exactly.
crime.
Well, they want, like serial killers especially, want to be caught and stopped because of the obsession.
They want the credit. I mean, listen, it's a lot.
But also
it's a
the
lot of hard
obsession
work.
to
Take it
stop.
from me. The planning.
You have to stop saying you're a
cleanup.
murderer.
This is a-
this is now recorded.
It's a horror-themed podcast. We do not condone nor endorse anything the dipshit
Just
male
say
host
you're not a
says.
criminal.
I'm not a crook.
But if he really wanted to get away with it, he would have just let the officers leave after their search was done. But instead, like I said, he invites them to sit down.
Yeah.
And is really dangling the body in front of them.
And why? Why?
And the
It's
only
just-
reason why he even killed the guy is because of the eye. Like, there's
Now,
no justification.
That's the thing. Some armchair psychiatrists over the years have suggested that Poe may have suffered from schizophrenia. And the fact that so many of his narrators suffer symptomatically from delusions, from symptoms of obsessive compulsive disorder, these violent mood swings, auditory hallucinations, these are symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia.
And also symptoms of heavy opioid and alcohol use.
That's the other thing. And Poe in real life was a habitual heavy user of alcohol and opium.
And undiagnosed depression.
Yes. So all of these things may be true at the same time, but the introduction right away in his stories of, hi, I'm going to tell you what's happening, but you really can't trust me because I'm an insane drug addict, is, it's
and
just
that's why he
excellent.
creates such unreliable narrators, too. It's almost like a admonishment or penance for his
Absolutely.
own
I mean, it's like
hallucinations.
Stephen King writing so many, characters
Yeah.
who struggle with alcoholism, or writers with writer's block. But,
Right.
Poe certainly puts his demons front and center with these
right under the floor.
paranoid drug using husband. I keep using the word husband.
Good.
I
It's
should
perfect.
say that
husband.
that is a term that we've
Created here
created
at Terra
here.
in Tandem as an idea for a reality show called
husbands.
Husbands.
Yeah. I feel like that describes itself. Coming soon on TLC.
It could be husbands and chives.
Yeah. God. I feel like it's
do
probably
want to
already a
say
show.
I do want to say that one thing I find really interesting is, as we are sort of wrapping up our part 2 of this deep dive, is the monomania of the eye in this story is similar to the monomania of the teeth in Berenice.
Or even just the fixation these men have on the women in their lives.
Absolutely.
That is-
but this one isn't a woman.
in
This is an
Poe's-
old man
In
with
Poe's,
a gooey eye.
No, but I'm saying, each of these narrators has a fixation on something.
But this is really clearly insanity, mental break.
In Poe's universe, and much in our modern society, what's more dangerous than a lonely white guy who's obsessed with you and has nothing but time and resources?
Yeah.
So that's our deep dive, Edgar Allan Poe.
Part
Duh. And we are going to be coming back to examine more of the master's work. We hope you enjoyed this.
Feel free to send us a DM on Instagram at Terra in Tandem if there's any particular horror Poe or mystery Poe
We'd
story
love to hear it.
you want us to talk
Now,
about.
we're extremely busy and popular people, but I'm sure we'll get around to it.
Don't be rude.
I can't not be.
Well, I have to finish the wall if you want to come help me downstairs.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Awesome.
I know that we've got half a keg of Amontillado down there that you promised me, and
Yeah, it's just behind that. It's down there.
it's behind
waiting
that.
for
It's
us.
behind
Yeah.
that unfinished brick wall.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me just put on my masquerade jester costume, and I'll meet you down there. Bye, everyone.
See you next time by myself. Terror in Tandem is written, produced, and recorded by Laura and Richard Mathiasen, and edited and mixed by Richard Mathiasen. Our theme was written and performed by Carrie Denver, and all other music was written and performed by David Suspanic. All opinions expressed on this podcast are our own and should be taken as such. Thanks for listening, and please remember to give us a like, a review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time. We're still